Okay, welcome to Malcolm Pein's first ever chess-based server broadcast. We're on Play Chess, and you can probably see me as well as hear me. Obviously there's a downside to that, but we're going to look at the first game of the World Chess Championship, recently played in Moscow between Boris Gelfand and Vishy Anand. Those of you who saw the opening ceremony would have seen that they drew for colours with paintbrushes, because the venue is of course the State Tretiakov Gallery in Moscow that has nearly 2,000 masterpieces of Soviet art, and the sponsor, Andrei Filatov, who's a billionaire, in fact, who had a very pleasant lunch with in London a few weeks ago, told me that actually one of his main ideas of sponsoring chess and sponsoring the World Championship generally is, of course, to highlight art, and in this case Soviet art. He sees synergies between art and chess and culture, and those are his prime motivations for supporting the match. Quite apart from that, of course, he's also, as some of you may know, an old friend of Boris Gelfand, and they actually studied chess at Minsk University together, which was very interesting. And those of you who read Chess Monthly magazine that I publish from London will have seen a few comments that Andrei Filatov made to me over lunch about what they studied at university, which is extremely interesting. But in the meantime, I'm sure you're really all very, very keen to have a look at what happened in Game 1. Now, Anand was white, and I think, well, we're about to see a little bit of a surprise. Okay, so Anand played d4, and Vishy, of course, can play d4 or e4. I thought at some point he might want to test Gelfand's Petrov, but perhaps he doesn't want to do that in the first game. In the first game, of course, you desperately want to avoid a defeat, and as we know, Anand managed to lose his first game, now against Topalov in 2010. So the next move was c4, g6, and I'd like to apologise to anyone who might be listening, but I'm currently getting a phone call and two people trying to get me on Skype simultaneously, which means there's either been an earthquake or it's just a very unpleasant coincidence. Let's carry on. Knight c3, d5. Now, a real surprise move, this. First of all, because if you look at your chess-based mega database, you'll notice immediately that the Grunfeld hasn't appeared in Gelfand's repertoire, at least for the last 5 years. And secondly, of course, Anand played the Grunfeld against Topalov in Game 1 and was absolutely crushed. And of course, the Grunfeld is generally thought, and I think it's very, very unfair, but it's generally thought of as a little bit risky at the very, very, very top level, because historically, Black has lost quite a few games with the Grunfeld in World Championship matches. You can go back to the Karpov-Kasparov games from Seville, for example, and then, of course, there's the 2010 Game 1 in Sofia. So, Anand was probably a little bit surprised by the Grunfeld, since Gelfand tends to play exclusively the Slav with a6, or the semi-Slav, or the Tartakova, or the Nimzo Indian / Queen's Indian. So this must have been a little bit of a surprise. Okay, so 4 knight f3, bishop g7, and now Anand played the main counter to the Grunfeld, which is the exchange variation, so named, of course, because white exchanges pawns. Here we go. And then he takes the centre. And if there is a refutation of the Grunfeld defence, then this has got to be it, because white establishes this wonderful pawn centre. This wonderful pawn centre, and essentially, if Black doesn't do anything about that pawn centre, then White is just going to literally charge down the board and crush Black on the king side. So, okay.
Under. There, just in between. A little bit higher. Yep, there. Okay, where should we?
Alright, so Gelfand countered in the centre. Now the key square for Black, of course, in this variation of the Grunfeld is d4. If Black doesn't attack the d4 square, then White has complete freedom of action. And you'll notice that Black has a lot of ways of attacking the d4 square. He can move his knight to c6, he can put his bishop on g4. So there's a variety of ways that this square can come under a lot of pressure very, very quickly. Now the usual move in this position is 8 bishop e3 or 8 rook b1. Rook b1 is the trendy move, if you like, in recent... Well, 8 bishop e3, if we're going very current, is the current fashion. But 8 rook b1 was the move that actually turned 7 knight f3 into a series variation. When I wrote a book on the Grunfeld in 1979, 99% of the games went 7 bishop c4 as opposed to 7 knight f3. Knight f3 was considered to be a mistake because it allowed that pin that I've just pointed out. But then various players, one of whom a certain G. Kasparov, who played it against Nazis at the Malta Olympiad in 1980, discovered that actually rook b1 is a very, very good way of playing, and latterly Karpov played 8 bishop e3 and caused Gary some problems, and also Vladimir Kramnik caused Gary some problems with that move in 2000. So, in general, the exchange variation is the critical test, but not the move that Vichy played now, which really surprised me. Bishop b5 check. Now, that's been played plenty of times, but historically it's been thought of as a little bit of a grandmaster drawing line. It doesn't actually challenge black very much, or at least not in the way it's conventionally played. So that was a real surprise. Bishop e3 or rook b1 are the challenging moves here. So the best move for black is just to go knight c6, and that's what Boris did fairly quickly. And now there's a main line which we're not going to go through because it's really just a test, but normally I would go through it, which would be bishop e3, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, bishop g4. And essentially what happens in these positions is that white takes on c6, losing the 2 bishops, but black gets a weak c6 pawn, but black has enough pressure on d4 to hold the balance. And you can look in your chess base and find quite a few grandmaster draws in that line. Not an awful lot happens, although there is one game which is worth looking at for historical interest, which is that Anand actually played Shirov as white in this line and achieved an advantage, but that was in a rapid game at Melody Amber, and Shirov didn't play the best moves. So Anand's just opted for safety. He's playing something that he's played before. He knows what he's doing, and I was expecting the game to be fairly peaceful. The next one, though, surprised me. d5. Now, the reason this move surprised me was because I had this strange feeling in the back of my mind that I'd seen it before, even though it's a very, very rare game. And then I realised why I'd seen this move before. It's because I'd actually played it myself. Only it was 30 years ago at least, and my recollection of it isn't perfect. But I do recall, as a young player making his way in the game, trying to get his first IM norm, unsuccessfully I might add, I played a tournament in Manchester called the Benedictine International. Now, Benedictine is... but the Benedictine is named after, obviously, the Benedictine monks who make something called the Benedictine liqueur, which is extremely nice. And the company Benedictine used to sponsor this tournament in Manchester. It was held in Manchester University. And it usually happened, I think, directly after the Lloyds Bank tournament, if I remember well. But it's 30 years ago, so it might have been before the Lloyds Bank tournament. And what they used to do in advance of the tournament, before the first round, was they used to give you a lovely little bottle of Benedictine liqueur. Now, it may be because I'd drunk too much of these that I actually played this move 9d5. And I remember I played it against the Hungarian Grandmaster Ferentos. And when I went d5, I did it because I hadn't seen knight c6 in such detail. Remember, this is before the age of computers, before the age of the internet. And I think the only book I had was the Grunfeld Defence by Bill Hartston, which is a great book. I just thought, well, maybe d5's a move. And of course, without computers, it doesn't look like a bad move. So I played it. And I was quite surprised when Ferentos played exactly what Gelfand played. He played Queen a5. And I went into a half an hour think at that point, and I played Rook b1, which is also what Anand played. And it's at this point, I'm afraid, that my memory runs out, but okay, it's not really that important what happened in one of Malcolm Payne's games 30 years ago, but it was just a bit of a surprise to see this variation. And I'm telling you the anecdote, if only to show you and to demonstrate to you what a rare variation this actually is. I mean, I don't think this move's been played at the top level. Which makes you wonder whether or not this was some preparation that Vichy caught Boris in. However, as we'll soon see, black doesn't seem unduly troubled. Now, I'm pretty sure that Ferentos played bishop takes c3 check now against me and beat me. Boris played a6, which also seems to just equalise. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. And now if we look at this position, black's got c3, he's got a2. He's not worried about dx takes c6 because, frankly, that pawn can be recaptured at any time. I mean, if white captures that pawn on c6, how's he going to protect it? So you'd have to feel this position was okay for black, but there is a little bit of venom. Castles, an excellent move. Now, those of you who know anything about 8 rook b1 will recognise a move like that. What white's saying is, look, I've got the centre, and now I must strive for the initiative. So take my pawns. Take all of them. So Anand has to choose which one to take. He grabbed the a-pawn. Now, when you sacrifice a pawn like an a-pawn in these sorts of positions, you've got to bear in mind that if black manages to stay on the board for another 50 moves, then this a6 pawn might eventually become a queen. So you have to be a little bit careful. You have to be sure that you've got some compensation, that you've got some initiative. Now, Vishy went rook b2, attacking the queen. Of course, his rook was on prise. Queen a5, and now d6. Now, white must disrupt the black position. If white doesn't do something, black will castle, and then he'll have the 2 bishops and an extra pawn. So Vishy's main aim, I'd say, at this stage is actually to stop black from castling, and also, if at all possible, to get this pawn to go to e5, because then the bishop on g7 will be cut out, and the pawn centre will be, well, it'll be cemented, and when black loses in the Grunfeld, he usually loses because this d-pawn, Davy the d-pawn, comes down the board and either wins a piece or wins material, or just by its sheer presence on d6 or d7 paralyses the black pieces. So black's got to be extremely careful. I mean, some Grunfeld alarm bells go at this point, but I don't actually know to what extent Boris had prepared this position, but he certainly solved the problems very, very effectively. I was really impressed with his next move. Calmly played rook a7. Now, you don't often get development of rooks like that in the Grunfeld. In fact, can't actually remember a Grunfeld position where black actually played rook a7. Surprising. The rook usually comes into the centre, either to the c file, which can become open, or indeed rook d8. So rook a7 was actually a really, really clever move. First of all, it covers this square, thereby preventing the pawn from going any further in the future. And secondly, it also covers this square. So if the pawn takes on e7, the rook comes into play, it protects the king. Very, very, very good play. So it's almost certain that, in fact, and the computers bear this out now, I guess, that black is probably doing all right. Now, if you were trying to play for an advantage with white here, I suppose what you'd do is you'd try and play the move pawn e4 to e5, but this simply, for some reason, didn't appeal to Anand. I'm not sure why, but if you were trying for an advantage, that's what you'd play. My sense was that after his next move, he couldn't possibly have an edge. Let's see what he did. He went bishop g5. Interestingly enough, I also thought that possibly the move bishop f4 was possible, but it's quite natural. It supports the pawn on d6, and also it's saying if you take on d6, I take back with a bishop and you can't castle. So I thought that was more natural. And in particular, of course, there was also the added possibility of maybe the knight coming there, then it might go there, it might also go to c4. I thought bishop f4 was sharper, and I think in practice perhaps it was a better move. I mean, the computer evaluations are about the same, and my feeling was that bishop f4 would probably set black a few more problems, because of course if the knight comes to e5 and then it's threatening to hop into other squares, black might be convinced to give up his bishop for it, and in those circumstances his king is permanently weak. And although your Fritz or your Ribke might say that the position is equal, in practice you wouldn't want to play a position without your dark squared bishop. You'd have holes on g7 and all round your king. So I thought bishop f4 was probably a better move, but the move that was played was bishop g5. But now Boris solves the problems completely. Pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, and now think about it. What would you play? Just think about it for a second. You're black, you're in game 1 of a World Chess Championship match. Avoiding defeat is absolutely essential. There's a concrete threat, I suppose, of queen takes c6 check. And think about black's positional advantages. What positional advantages has he got? Yeah, you will have probably spotted the 2 bishops. And also, in what phase of the game is a weak, isolated pawn like that quite handy? Well, of course, it's the endgame, because in the endgame, it's a pass pawn. So, rook d7, hitting the queen, queen takes c6, and now queen c7. Excellent move in practice, just saying, well, all endgames are good for me. I've got two bishops, I've got a passed pawn, I can't come to any harm. Now, maybe analysis will show that there was a better continuation, but when I saw this, I thought, well, this is just perfect for Boris. He's, he must be nervous. It's game one of the World Chess Championship, everything at stake. He's got the black pieces, but he'll be so happy with his position because he simply cannot lose. And in fact, at this point, I started to fear for Vichy a little bit. Queen takes queen, there seems to be nothing better. Remember that all the time, in all variations, black has this residual threat of bishop takes c3. So it's not as if white has got a huge number of options here. So queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and now bishop f4 hitting the rook, rook b7. Would you like to exchange pieces? Because the more pieces we exchange, the more powerful my pass pawn and two bishops become, of course. No, I don't, and I want to protect my c-pawn. Castles. So let's look at this position. It must be slightly better for black. I mean, in practice, I'd say if this was a game where I was playing somebody else roughly rated the same as me, with similarly inadequate knowledge and technique, I'd be playing for a win. Of course, one of the hallmarks of fantastic players like Anand and Gelfand is that they always manage to limit their disadvantage. So even when players of my strength, I'm roughly 2400 and falling, think there's danger, these guys can usually find a path to limit that danger and avoid defeat. But if I was faced with two bishops and a passed a pawn as white, I'd be seriously worried. It's interesting to note, by the way, if we can just flip back a few moves, that in terms of the psychological battle, I think that after that in this position, that Vichy actually had a very, very long think. It was as if there was something he was planning or intending that he suddenly discovered didn't work. Anyway, that may explain why we rapidly got to this position where black is simply somewhat better. So, I guess it's at this point you sit there and you think, right, how can I limit my disadvantage? How can I equalise? So Anand comes up with quite a good plan. First of all, he homes in on the weakness in black's position, which is the c5 pawn. Rook e8 counter-attacking the e pawn. And knight d2. The other possibility was e5. But of course that lets out one of the bishops. So intuitively you'd say to yourself, irrespective of whatever your computer might say, you'd want to avoid that. Because although you might think that you're keeping this guy in the box, remember that after some move like that, he'll break out. So I think Anand's continuation was quite sensible. He went knight d2. He's saying, because remember, black's got a white squared bishop, white hasn't. So keeping a pawn on a white square will limit the scope of the enemy bishop. You don't want too many white squares open when your opponent's got the only white squared bishop in town. And the other thing about this is it gives the possibility of the pawn coming to f4, and then maybe the pawn coming to e5, and then the knight coming to e4. So, it's sort of saying, okay, I know I'm a bit worse here, but bear in mind I've got my plans too, if you don't play accurately. Okay, now Boris played f5, which looks extremely natural. I mean, you've got two bishops, you want to be opening the game for them, so I thought f5 was the right move. But interestingly enough, all the engines, Fritz, Ribka, everybody, Houdini, everybody, were quite interested in bishop d7. The main reason being that after bishop takes c5, rook c8, black's winning this pawn back. All the tactics work for black here. If bishop b4, rook takes b4, because of course we have an unprotected piece. And when you're looking for tactical possibilities, the first thing you look for is how many pieces are unprotected in your opponent's position. So, rook e8, knight d2, keeping it very solid, f5, and now Vichy calmly played f3. I guess bishop d7 might be a move now. I haven't actually had time to look at that in depth yet, because we're looking at this game a little more than an hour after it's finished. But I guess that Boris, to a certain extent, psychologically, would have been very, very happy with the draw at the start of the game. So he now played pawn takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop f5, and I think it was in this position that a draw was agreed. I'm pretty confident that there were ways for Boris to play on. Possibly if he was, if you like, a game down in the match, he wouldn't have opted for pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, bishop f5. But this certainly is pretty much equal. And the players were fairly scathing afterwards of a question at the press conference where somebody said, "Well, wasn't Black actually better?" Well, no. In this position, he certainly isn't better. I'm not even claiming he was significantly better before. I'm simply saying that he could have prolonged the game at no risk before. Now in this position, in the final position, it seems to me that after the move rook e1, there's a threat of knight f6 check, winning the rook, and there's also now a double threat to the c5 pawn. Remember that this pawn is actually under pressure from both the bishop and the knight. So in this position there's probably no choice for Black other than to take on e4. Not much choice. And then after pawn takes back, Black has a nominal advantage. He's got a pawn, an outside pass pawn, but no, this position is just dead equal, and probably a waste of time playing on. And so the players very naturally agreed to draw. So Boris will be white in game 2, which is tomorrow. We'll be on the server at 12 o'clock UK, 0700 Eastern and 1300 Central European time. See you there.